Hey, I'm Hesham, you're watching Pushing Film. There are some important considerations when it comes to scanning half-frame film, whether you do it yourself or at a lab. Should you scan frames in pairs or individually? Will the lab charge you more money to scan double the shots? And what's the best way to go about digitizing yourself at home? Today I'm going to answer these questions and give you some tips that I've learned through my years of experience and trial and error. And with the Pentax 17 having just launched, I've naturally seen an increased interest in this topic. I've placed chapter markers below, but highly recommend that you watch these first chapters on important considerations. The biggest consideration will often be whether to scan frames individually or in pairs. Part of the fun of shooting half frame is making diptychs, or intentionally shooting images in pairs. My advice after both experience and research is to get your frames scanned individually. You can always pair them back up afterwards using a number of methods. There are a few important reasons that I'm giving this recommendation. First of all, your exposures and white balance should match well when scanning two frames as one. You can't optimize for both exposures simultaneously while scanning, so one image might look out of whack next to the other. This applies to both lab or DIY scanning. Secondly, every half-frame camera exposes the frames a little differently on the strip of film. Lab scanners might especially have a hard time getting two half frames into one 35mm sized scan without cropping part of the image and messing things up. I've spoken to lab operators about this, and it's one of the reasons some labs might recommend scanning frames individually. Lastly, you'll get better resolution and quality out of each image when scanning it individually. You can get closer with your macro lens when DIY scanning and fill more of the frame for a higher pixel count. Of course, scanning frames as pairs is fine too, and I do enjoy doing that with certain shots on some rolls. It's just worth noting some of these considerations if you do scan as pairs. Let's talk about the consideration of cost when having your film scanned by a lab. Since you get double the frames, some labs might charge extra for the scanning component at least. However, this surcharge can vary from lab to lab. I think it's fair if a lab wants to charge more if they're actually spending more time and effort, depending on their equipment and workflow. But it's only really the scanning and file handling components that differ from regular 35mm film. If a lab performs frame-by-frame corrections while scanning, this is where that extra charge might be warranted. But then again, do they charge differently for 24-shot rolls versus 36-shot rolls? Is the surcharge proportional to the added time or effort? It's a contentious topic, and I think labs should charge fairly if they do, as not to dissuade beginners and regular photographers from shooting half frame. With prints, it makes more sense to pay for twice the shots, but part of the appeal of half frame is the cost saving created by having double the shots. So you wouldn't want to negate those savings completely with high surcharges for scanning. I spoke to the guys at Irahas Camera here in Melbourne about this topic, and they develop and scan half frames individually, with no extra surcharge. They use Noritsu scanners and deliver high-res images by default, so it's nice to see options like this still exist to encourage half-frame shooters. But your access will vary depending where you live, or you might have a preference for something different, like scanning it yourself. And that brings me to the next chapter of the video, which is DIY digitization of half-frame film. Of all methods, you'll probably know that I prefer using a digital camera as opposed to a dedicated home scanner. A flatbed or other 35mm capable scanners will work fine, and I would recommend that if you already have one. But so-called camera scanning is orders of magnitude faster compared to a flatbed, PlusTech, or similar options. It also offers better quality compared to consumer scanners. It lets you take advantage of equipment you may already own, so it's been the method that I use and recommend for years now, ever since selling off my Epson flatbed. Half frames are quite small, so the magnification capabilities offered by this method can give you great results. I've made a number of videos related to digitizing film, including a comprehensive guide to batch scanning color negative film with NLP, so check out my full film scanning playlist if you're new to all this. I'll also be doing an updated guide soon, a video on the latest NLP, and more videos related to this topic. But here's a basic overview to digitizing half-frame negatives at home using a camera. You basically photograph the illuminated frames using a camera and high magnification, then invert them on your computer. A macro lens is best, but there are alternatives if you can't justify the purchase of one. Next, you'll need a film holder and even diffused light. for optimal results. I recommend something with a dedicated half frame mask such as this one on the Essential film holder. Something like the EFH is also good if you're new to all this and don't have perfectly diffused light. It creates ideal height from the diffuser, shields stray light when doing individual frames, and can be used for other film formats using different masks, like if you shoot 120 and normal 35mm film. You can get away with just using a full-size 35mm mask, whether it's this holder or others, and there are plenty of options out there for film holders these days. For the light source, you can use a tracing pad, video light, a dedicated film scanning light like what I've got here, but scan quality, ease, and speed will generally go up the more you spend, but not always proportionally. So you can check out some of my other videos on film scanning lights if you want. You can use a tripod, a table-mounted camera arm, or a dedicated copy stand to hold the camera overhead. I prefer using a copy stand, and the barrier to entry is getting lower. For example, I mentioned a 3D printed option from Dispo Lens in a recent video, and there are more options coming out from brands like Negative Supply at lower costs than what they used to. If you're just dipping your toes in the water, start with what you already have or what you can most afford. By the way, you can also DIY a lot of this gear if you're so inclined and have the resources. There are some great guides out there and a multitude of ways to go about the process. Either way, once you have everything rigged up, you individually photograph each frame using consistent camera settings. My batch scanning guide goes into more detail on this. I highly recommend doing this while your film is still uncut, especially with half frames. It'll save you a lot of time since you might have a lot of frames on one roll. So ask your lab to leave your film uncut if you're scanning it yourself. I'm using strips for this example here since I already scanned these in the past and cut them down for storage. Import your images and crop them down to match the 3:4 ratio, leaving a little bit of the border. Use the border to pick the white balance and copy these settings to all your frames. If you're in Lightroom like me, I recommend using Negative Lab Pro. You can try it for free for 24 conversions using the link in this video description. NLP is great for batch converting images and having full creative control. It also accounts for the border during conversion and leaves it in after the conversion. This is great if you want to pair images back up later, maintaining the original rough border from your negatives. I like to keep everything in Lightroom and create new JPEGs of the now positive images rendered by NLP. There are alternative options for software out there, or the option to just invert them yourself manually, but in my experience, that's quite time consuming, especially when you're doing a lot of frames. If you are scanning frames as pairs, here's how I go about it. Crop into one frame out of the two for the conversion and then crop back out afterwards. Just be aware of the issue I mentioned earlier if your exposure or white balance varies significantly between the two shots. You can also crop and separate the images into two before converting, or apply localized adjustments to just half of the full frame. But these are more reasons why I just recommend scanning and converting the frames individually. For pairing individual images into diptychs, I like to use the print module in Lightroom. Use the contact sheet layout, increase to 2 columns, set a black page background, and any 3:2 ratio page dimensions. So 6:4 or 8:12 inches are some examples. Then adjust your cell size, cropping or zoom options to align things how you want. Print to a JPEG file using whatever resolution you require. And that's it. The added bonus here is that you can pair whichever images you like, even if they weren't shot sequentially. You can also do it manually in Photoshop or through a number of different methods. So that's the basic overview of digitizing half frames yourself. Remember to check out my previous batch scanning videos for more in-depth aspects of this, or subscribe for my updated guides, which will be coming out later. I'll end with a few extra tips for half frame. First of all, half frame can be a fun way to get creative with image pairings because of the vertical orientation of the vast majority of half frame cameras and the 3:4 ratio. You can even shoot with triptychs in mind or larger collages made up of a whole roll, for example. Next, half frame cameras are a good way to justify shooting 24 shot rolls, which should give you at least 48 frames and more often 50 plus. Another tip is that half frame results in increased depth of field compared to full 35mm frame. So you can use that to your advantage and get more out of wider apertures. Another tip I have is that using low speed film is great for your half frame cameras, partially due to the previous point, but you also tend to get finer grain and cleaner images. This can counteract the loss of resolution from half frame and give you great results. My favorites are Kodak Ektar and Ilford Pan F50. Lastly, don't underestimate the capability of half frame. With high quality film and scans, you'd be surprised what you can get. Combine that with a good lens and metering, and you can really squeeze a lot out of the format. So I hope this video was helpful, and leave a comment if you have any other questions. I or someone else might have the answer, and I'm always open to hearing your suggestions. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.